Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to start in about 1 minute. We'll just let the attendees filter in to our virtual room, and we'll get started shortly. All right, folks, it looks like we are filling up the room, but just so there's no dead air here, I'll go ahead and get started and introduce our discussion today. My name is Samir Lalwani. I direct the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. Stimson Center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., been around for over 30 years. And the South Asia program focuses a lot, as the name suggests, on the South Asia or Southern Asian region of the Indo-Pacific. We tend to focus a lot on all types of competition and conflict in the region, from civil war to geopolitical and economic competition to conventional conflict and nuclear crisis bargaining. So all the way up the escalation ladder. Today, we're going to spend some time thinking a little bit on sort of the lower end of that spectrum, but it's highly relevant given the events of this past week. And frankly, the last 20 years, the U.S. has had troops deployed in Afghanistan. The topic of our discussion today is institution building in weak states, the primacy of local politics. And it features a book by a friend of our program, Andrew Radin. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce a little bit about the panel, our speakers, and then we'll have a presentation on the book, some discussing comments, and then we'll open up to audience Q&A. And so for all of you who are attending today via the Zoom function, you feel free to input your questions, send questions via the Q&A box with your name and affiliation, and we'll make sure to feature those in the discussion. So let me start off by just introducing Dr. Andrew Radin, who is the author of the book that is the subject of our discussion today. He is a political scientist at the RAND Corporation. His research interests focus on European security, NATO, Russia's foreign policy, state building, security sector reform, and peace operations. And of course, his book covers a wide range of case studies from Bosnia and Herzegovina to Kosovo, Iraq, Timor-Leste. And also importantly, he spent 2 years at the Pentagon, detailed from RAND, to serve as a country director for Afghanistan at the Office of the Undersecretary for Defense for Policy. And so he's got a wealth of experience across the globe, and has some actually direct experience working on these problem sets very recently. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and at the University of Southern California, and received a PhD in political science from MIT. Joined with me as well is my friend and colleague and deputy director of our South Asia program, Elizabeth Threlkeld, who has been at the Stimson Center for several years now. And she has actually just recently completed a paper or a report, frankly, on this problem set of Afghanistan and Pakistan relations that will be coming out from the U.S. Institute of Peace sometime this year. And so we've got two leading experts on this subject to come at this from different vantage points a little bit. and hopefully we'll have a really robust discussion and some useful insights for understanding what's unfolding in the region in Afghanistan today. So with that, I'm going to start off with Andrew, to have him spend maybe 15 minutes introducing the book, the theory, the applications, and maybe some commentary on how it applies to our contemporary situation. And then we'll turn to Elizabeth for some discussion remarks as well. All right, over to you, Andrew.
Thank you so much. And you see my slides, correct? We got them. Okay. I'd like to thank you all for coming today. It's really great to have the ability to be here and be able to tell you about my book and some implications of it for Afghanistan. There we go. I think that most of you will be tracking the context in Afghanistan for this discussion. In February of 2020, the US and the Taliban came to an agreement that included the beginning of negotiations on a political settlement for Afghanistan. It also included a requirement that the US withdraw forces before May of 2021, pending the Taliban's commitments, fulfilling their commitments as well. President Biden earlier this week announced that the US would remove all US troops by September 11th of 2021. So this presentation is about exploring kind of a best case scenario, I think, of what might happen in Afghanistan. It proceeds under the assumption that the Afghan parties continue with their negotiations and arrive at some sort of peace settlement for the future of the country. This settlement might include temporary transitional administration, some sort of specified distribution of posts among the parties, a timeline for the selection of a permanent government, some sort of security arrangements, a ceasefire, and critically, an international mission that would help to implement the agreement and provide potentially other support. So in thinking about this kind of best case scenario, I think it's useful to look at lessons that we have from previous international missions. And that's where my book comes in. The book focuses on exploring when and how the international community is able to improve institutions in post-conflict societies and other societies, and has, as I'll explain, several different lessons and implications for the challenges facing a mission in Afghanistan and what it would do. Now, we can talk more about how likely this scenario that I'm talking about looks at. There's all kinds of challenges facing the peace process, but I think it's useful as the international community proceeds to sort of keep in mind what the scope and challenges facing this mission might be. As Samir mentioned, let me start with a caveat. I was detailed from RAND to the Department of Defense from 2018 to 2020. Let me emphasize that what I'm going to say today is my own opinion and doesn't reflect any kind of U.S. government or other views. The presentation is derived from my book as well as from open sources. Today, I'm going to first talk about what I mean by institution building and intervention, why it's important. I'm going to talk about some theories from the book about successful institution building, when and why we get good outcomes in post-conflict societies, some lessons from transitional administrations, from the case studies in the book on security sector reform, and then finish with some conclusions. The book focuses on institution building, by which I mean international efforts to improve state institutions. State institutions, I mean basically parts of the state that perform particular functions: policing, military, judiciary, etc. I would argue, and you can see in the literature from the UN, that the effort to improve post-conflict improve state institutions is fundamental to peace. Basically, state institutions are believed to help resolve conflict in societies emerging from civil war. And security institutions are particularly important in this respect. Where you have an effective police and military that can address internal threats and provide basic security, that's important. Where these bodies can help to bring in former combatants and ensure that they don't threaten security in the future, that's important. It's also really important that the security sector is accountable and that it doesn't undermine the peace themselves. When and how international efforts to make these institutions better, how I describe it as effective, accountable, and following the rule of law is critically important in ensuring that a peace settlement can be maintained over time. The book goes into detail in exploring measures for success, developing scores for effectiveness, accountability, and the rule of law, which is useful for judging when and why different administrations or missions are effective. I can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A or offline, or you can look at the book. And the book is not only about post-conflict societies, it also tries to draw implications out for other efforts helping countries develop counterterrorism forces or develop their military to respond to external threats. The book looks at three different competing but also complementary explanations for when and why the international community is able to help post-conflict countries. The first is basically international resources. The argument is pretty simple. The more that the international community has in terms of troops, money, the better able it is to create positive change. The mission's mandate is particularly important here. I look at kind of three levels of mandate. Monitor, where the mission can observe things on the ground, report back. Train and equip, where it can provide assistance and improve particular state institutions. And administer, where the mission has some sort of executive power on the ground. By my observation, an international mission in the future in Afghanistan as part of a peace settlement is probably going to be on the lower end of the spectrum. The Taliban has emphasized that their primary goal is to remove foreign influence, and there's obviously fatigue on the side of the international community. So that's, I think, an important scoping point. Second theory that the book looks at, which I think is useful but not definitive, is path dependence. Basically, the argument that state institutions remain the same over time. That when the international community leaves, they're likely to revert back to what they were before. And hence that successful intervention is most likely in places that had higher levels of development to start with. For example, in Germany and Japan. This approach, I think, might be useful to think about what would happen to Afghanistan were there to be no international mission thereafter. My argument in the book is that the two theories I laid out don't pay enough attention to how local and international actors interact with each other, and that international missions are often stymied because they face opposition from within the country that they're trying to help. And they face this opposition in particular because of what they're asking for. And what they're asking for threatens the interests of the elites and the people inside of the country. The book focuses on two key local interests. The first is nationalist goals, basically the idea that a group should have run its own territory. So here, a group like an ethnic group or an ideological group. Where the international community proposes demands or recommendations that threaten these groups' interests, I expect to see public protests given the popularity of nationalist goals. And these public protests delegitimize the international community and lead to the failure of their objectives. The second key interest, which is of particular importance in Afghanistan, is elite patron-client networks. Elites have networks inside of state institutions they use to distribute resources to their supporter, to receive resources themselves, to stay in power. The international community, I argue, is not able to fully implement reforms that threaten these elite patron-client networks because elites privately obstruct their efforts. The international community they don't have a home field advantage. They ultimately rely on their ability to understand what's happening inside of these state institutions, which is sort of inevitably partial. So depending on how much resources they have, they achieve more or less success, my argument goes. The book claims that foreign missions ultimately achieve the greatest success when they propose improvements that do not provoke domestic opposition, basically navigating around the local interest and trying to find ways to improve state institutions in ways that accommodate these interests and thereby achieve the best outcomes. The book focuses on looking at central government, police, and military state institutions. I look at 4 post-conflict countries: Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, East Timor, and then another case with much lower resources, Ukraine, where I had a personal experience working on a RAND Corporation project that you can read about. So let me talk a bit about interim administrations, which happen typically when there's a settlement of some kind before the election or selection of a permanent government. Here, groups recognize that there's an interim administration, contest control, and often challenge the legitimacy of international actors when they don't do what the groups want. You see this in Kosovo, for example. The UN administration there had basically complete executive control over the country. So they were able to build a first unelected administration and then hold elections under a constitutional framework. The Kosovo Albanian majority was welcoming to a degree of the UN's influence until it became clear that the UN was not going to move ahead with Kosovo's independence, their primary nationalist goal. The book explains how this led to riots that undermined the UN's authority and led the UN to accelerate discussions on Kosovo's independence. In Iraq, there's kind of a parallel story. The US Coalition Provisional Authority intended to build state institutions that would moderate conflict between the major groups in Iraq, and to take time in doing that. However, the Coalition Provisional Authority faced opposition from Shia elites, especially spearheaded by Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani. That made it clear to the CPA that they could not continue with their agenda, and they accelerated their plan for transitioning to Iraqi independence. So what can we learn from this for Afghanistan? First of all, that the groups recognize that in an interim phase, whoever shapes these institutions and secures power has an advantage in whatever the permanent administration is. And so even if groups have agreed to some sort of slow transition or whatever interim structures are, they continue to contest power, sometimes violently. Second point is that even the most powerful international missions, as in Kosovo and in Iraq, are constrained by local opposition. And if you have probably a lower resource mission in Afghanistan, its ability to shape the transition in a way that would be most desirable for the international community, considering the goals that have articulated, that will be pretty limited. The transitional period in Afghanistan is likely to be turbulent, and the international community is going to be best off by trying to find ways to make suggestions for what the future governance of Afghanistan will be that recognize the core group's interests, that the core groups that emerge and are represented in this interim administration. Turning now to security sector reform, I think that the security sector is really particularly critical for preserving peace. But that what the international community can do here is again, pretty limited. The book looks at Bosnia and Herzegovina, comparing 2 cases of military integration that succeeded while police reform failed, from about 2004 to 2006-07. In this period, the international community had what I would argue is the height of influence over any country in the past, let's say 10 or 15 years, under the leadership of Patty Ashton. Ashton was able to leverage resources across the international community. And he achieved success in military integration, but because there was an incremental approach that recognized what the limits of what the Bosnian Serbs were going to agree on. He, in particular, There were two entity militaries linked to the warring parties. The peace agreement preserved these two different militaries within the same state. Ashdown was able to create a state ministry of defense that exercised operational command over these two different entity militaries in the first step of reform. And then in the second step, create a single unified military while preserving elements of the military tradition and structure to recognize sort of the basic interests of the different groups. By contrast, in police reform, the international community proposed demands that threatened basically the Serbs' autonomy, and that led to public protests. So you see the importance of incrementalism. In Timor-Leste, you have an example where the UN had, again, a transitional administration, but after this transitional administration paid relatively little attention to the military. So that led to grievances among veterans and within the security forces that festered over time, leading to violence and the need for a return to intervention. So point here is the need to focus on ex-combatants and good administration of the security sector in these societies. In Iraq, in the case of police reform, the United States had tremendous resources, again, trained hundreds of thousands of Iraqi police. Even with that, I would argue that the US never really had the ability to challenge Shia control of the police, even during the surge in 2006, 2007. What developed was a Ministry of Interior where different groups, militias tied to different groups or political parties were basically represented inside of the ministry. By one account, you stopped at different floors of the elevator and you could tell which group was in charge. This is obviously not an ideal outcome for a Ministry of Interior or police force, but I think in some sense it's a best available one. It recognizes that the society is fundamentally politically divided and finds a way of balancing between the group's competing interests. In Ukraine, you have a case where there was much lower levels of international influence, and Ukraine achieved some success in improving its defense institutions by reverting back to Soviet-era structures. So path dependence is not always a bad thing. You also see how, in the absence of international influence or high levels of it, elites responded to international recommendations by implementing the ones that posed the least threat to their own patron-client networks and basically economic interests. So what does this mean for a post-settlement environment in Afghanistan? First of all, the Taliban and the current government or whoever is represented in this post-settlement period is likely to seek, at a minimum, a share of and control of the security forces, recognizing that control of the security forces goes hands in hand with political authority. But if we're thinking about some sort of power-sharing environment, you're going to need to have broad representation and integration of the security forces to achieve peace and to have some sort of stability going forward. If one side takes all, that's not going to work out. So what's the role of an international mission in doing that? It's important to understand that that's constrained by the level of resources. First of all, and second of all, by the politics of the situation. Even in Bosnia or Iraq, where you have more powerful missions than you might have in Afghanistan, it wasn't at all a straightforward story. So these resources mean that the international community is probably going to be limited in geographic scope and in what they can do. They might be able to provide advice. They might be able to provide some resources. But recognizing that the development of divided security institutions and taking into account what the local actors want is fundamental to achieving a good outcome, I think, for any international mission. And divided, but hopefully relatively stable, maybe more stable than Iraq, security institutions is probably kind of a best available outcome. Also important to bear in mind how past structures, such as for the Taliban when they were in power, the continuation of what security institutions exist now, or traditional types of governance and security forces in Afghanistan are likely to persist and recur. So let me offer some conclusions now. It might seem, if there were an international mission, that its role might be to push for kind of maximalist goals from the international community, achieving broad-based democracy, bringing the parties in Afghanistan together, ensuring very good adherence to human rights, things that the international community has pushed for a long time in Afghanistan. I'm not sure that that's the best approach. The book argues that there's limits to the international community's influence, even in the most powerful missions, and it's probably not going to have such a mission in Afghanistan. So recognition of what's achievable is really important, I think, to be able to achieve anything. So the book argues that the best approach for such a mission is to basically avoid threatening the core interests of the different groups, and to find ways to incrementally improve institutions. One piece of good news for such a mission is that there's a lot of expertise on Afghanistan that's built up, and hopefully that can be drawn on in the future. I think the real challenge is going to be that one of the key groups going forward is the Taliban. And the international community has not treated the Taliban as a legitimate actor in Afghanistan. There's been sanctions. There's been a relatively slow development of the peace process, as you can read, going back a decade now. So the challenge for the international community going forward is to figure out what the Taliban's kind of minimal goals are and how they can be recognized, accommodated to a degree inside of this new state, given the changes in international influence and the likely influence going forward. Security sector is a particularly important component of that. I think you can see in some of the works that have come out on the security sector a tendency to think about lessons from past civil wars where the rebel group is kind of integrated into the government. I think that's going to be a real challenge, and that probably isn't going to be sufficient for what the Taliban are looking for. So you have to think about perhaps new and creative ways to reorganize or adapt the security sector that are going to acknowledge the Taliban's pretty significant role, while also leading to acceptable and good outcomes from the perspective of the international community. So I'll stop there and look forward to comments from Elizabeth and your questions. Thank you.
Great. Elizabeth, over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Andrew. And thanks, Samir. I think as you both acknowledged, this is an appropriate week, albeit a challenging one, to take stock of institution building efforts in Afghanistan and reflect on what we can expect going forward as best we can tell at this point. To start, I really want to commend Andrew for this book. I would highly recommend it. It's deeply researched and comes from both a policy and an academic perspective. Really useful comparative case studies that I think shed a lot of light on what we can expect in Afghanistan, but also similar situations down the road. What I appreciate in particular is that it kind of walks a fine line. It encourages a heavy dose of humility of what's achievable in these sorts of missions, which I think is very well taken. Recognizes the many ways that local actors call the shots and constrain external influence. Even as I count myself as a skeptic in terms of externally driven institution building, I think the book also recognizes the political reality that there will be situations where these questions are important, where we can't write off institution building altogether. And so it comes to a pragmatic assessment of what types of reform efforts are most likely to succeed or perhaps least likely to fail. And that's a useful nugget to bring out for policymakers and academics alike. So briefly today, I think I'll try to focus on Afghanistan and highlight a few questions that came to me in applying the book's findings to that situation. So We'll call these two who's, a what, and a when. So who are the local actors and who are the foreign interveners? What is the role of stability or conflict in defining the scope for reform? And when in the intervention is institution building most likely to succeed? So to start out on the who's, first up is who are the local actors? I was really gratified, Andrew, in your presentation to hear you refer not just to the Afghan government or Afghan political elites, but also to the Taliban in that mix, because I think increasingly going forward, it's important to recognize that it's not just the formal government who will have a say in this, certainly. You know, among the Afghan government and elites, to date, over the last 20 years, we have seen some acceptance of official or formal institutions, but I think, as your book points out, really a retention of the patronage power via these unofficial, informal channels that have in some ways compromised the reform efforts that the international community has been pushing. So we've seen that in a number of different ways. Actually, I would highlight a recent article from the Afghanistan Analyst Network that has a useful analysis of a few of these institutions and how they have been shaped and in some ways manipulated by local political actors. So those include the Supreme Court, the Senate, local provincial councils, and the Independent Commission for overseeing the implementation of the Constitution. So across the board, ways through which local political elites have manipulated constitutional structures to ensure greater control over political and personal decisions. On the Taliban side, you know, I think looking at the ways that they have interacted with these or what they perceive to be externally driven institutions, right? The rejection of elections as something that they see as externally imposed and contrary to the tenets of Islam is one side of that spectrum. But simultaneously, the Taliban has also accepted tacitly some foreign funded or supported services in the areas of the country that they control or contest as a means of outsourcing governance and generating local support, right? Making sure that schools or health facilities, that sort of thing, in a way that they are able to manage, do continue to run. So I think that's an interesting middle ground that we've seen, and just showcases the way that the Taliban themselves have been a local actor on the governance side as well. You know, on the other side of the who question, who are the interveners? One thing, Andrew, I would like to get your thoughts on is many of the cases you look at in the book, there tends to be a relatively unified foreign presence, right? It's typically US-led or a coalition, something along those lines. It looks like there's perhaps a little bit of nuance there, but in the case of Afghanistan, and I think particularly going forward, where we do see so many competing external parties involved, right? Not just the US, but looking at NATO, looking at Russia and China and Iran and India and Pakistan. So how does cooperation and competition among outside parties impact institution building efforts and align with the book's findings? So moving on to what is the situation on the ground? So many of the case studies in the book explore kind of a variety of post-conflict scenarios with different outcomes. And we've seen a range of this in Afghanistan, right? The US-led coalition began those reform efforts after what seemed to be a decisive military victory. And it was seen to kind of open a window for post-conflict institution building. And only over time did the security situation really worsen. And so I wonder, Andrew, to follow up on that, you know, how does the level of stability or conflict on the ground impact prospects for institution building? And how do you assess how the US and other foreign interveners navigated that space? So to my mind, it seems like there's a trade-off in terms of what's achievable, where maybe in a more secure environment, you see external parties willing to push for more fundamental reforms, but as stability becomes a little bit more tenuous, that pulls back. And we see greater acceptance of issues like corruption, for example, that have long dogged these reform efforts. that are tacitly accepted for the sake of stability. So curious for your thoughts on that from Afghanistan and other case studies. And then finally on the when. So when is the action occurring? How long has the intervention lasted? I think similarly, as the intervention dragged on in Afghanistan and the Taliban insurgency gained steam, I would argue that local actors and even other foreign interveners lost confidence in the ability of the US to pursue institutional reform. Maybe similar to what you point out in terms of the delegitimization of the failed police reform efforts in Bosnia. So curious on that front, whether, there's a window of opportunity for foreign-backed institution building, and has it irrevocably closed in Afghanistan today? Very briefly wrapping up, I think it's safe to say it's not an optimistic picture from my view. As the US withdraws, it seems likely to become more difficult, if not impossible, to monitor and incentivize any sort of elite cooperation in a post-withdrawal scenario, given the reduced leverage we'll have. To a certain extent, it recalls the failure in Iraq to incorporate Sunnis into the Shia-dominated police forces on the security sector side. Similarly, just in general, chances of institution building seem reduced as the US and others will put even greater onus on stability over reform goals and as resources diminish. And then finally, I think we're likely to see greater reliance on these kind of enduring patron-client networks that will continue to dominate and become even more important as instability rises and kind of formal governance structures perhaps break down. And it will revert, as you were saying, to some of those previous structures that we've seen that have dominated the conflict landscape over the past 40 years. So I wish I could end on a more optimistic note, but congrats again on the book. And I think it really does shed some useful light on these issues.
Great. Andrew, do you want to take maybe just 2 minutes to take up some of the points that Elizabeth raised, or prefer to go to Q&A?
Yeah, I might use 3, but thank you, Elizabeth. That was really, really helpful, and I really appreciate your comments. I think you've highlighted the intent and some of the book's contribution. So thank you for that. Let me say a word first about the prospects for future reform and international assistance. I think one striking thing that you heard from President Biden's remarks earlier this week is the intent of the US to continue to provide diplomatic, economic, and also security support, an intent to continue to support the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. How that's going to look or how that's going to change, I think is an important question. But I think that points to the fact that the international community, at least by how that's framed, is not abandoning the hope of supporting and helping and even reforming Afghan institutions. Is changing how it goes about that. How is that going to look if there's a settlement, if there's continued conflict? All important questions, but I don't think that the window for institution building is closed at all. Also important that in the Doha Agreement Taliban signed, there's an ask for that the U.S. will or commitment as well by the U.S. to provide economic support going forward and to have a good relationship with whatever the post-settlement government is. And I think that also points to the fact that perhaps the Taliban recognize the need for continued international assistance. At a minimum in the economic space, security is a more complicated topic, but that's framing hopefully a recognition of the importance of continued international support to maintain peace and build security and prosperity in Afghanistan. So let me talk about foreign interveners. One of the key resources in the international resource side is coordination among the international community. And I think that is really important. I think that's one way that the international community can harm themselves is by different people asking for different things and local actors taking advantage of that. And I think that's going to be a key challenge in Afghanistan, especially with the, as you say, the profusion of different external actors who might be pursuing different objectives and asking for different things. Even when there was a relatively unified set of goals, like in Bosnia or Kosovo, you have internal conflict of what to ask for. And if that was just the US and NATO and the UN, imagine Russia, China, Iran, all sort of different agendas and stories in Afghanistan. So I think you're right to highlight that. And that's going to be another challenge if as the mission, as the peace process goes ahead, how for US policymakers to recalibrate and rethink the approach in Afghanistan, recognizing that different range of actors. Does the level of stability determine the potential for reform? I think Iraq is a useful example here, where you have really fundamental changes to the Iraqi state happening under the CPA in the midst of pretty high levels of violence, and an establishment of a government in a space where it was possible, not in a terrific way, to conduct governance like inside of the green zone and have a degree of stability of the central state continuing in the midst of high levels of violence in the rest of the country. I think that the level of violence determines the shape and ability of the mission to function. You see this in my other work. I've written about African-led peace operations or the UN operations in Africa. And you see how, you see this in Timor too, where different levels and different times, with a more permissive environment, it's a lot easier for the UN or others to conduct their missions and spend less on security, driving people around in armored cars, versus, they can still do it if there is high levels of violence. It just gets much harder and much more expensive. And so the resources don't go as far, maybe, I think is part of the story. Time is important. I think over time, the potential for change becomes less visible. It's easier to imagine right after a civil war, big changes. I think that's in part because of the institutions that get built and sort of come to fruition. I think you see that a little bit with the discourse that's been in the media on the discussions about what a post-settlement government would look like in Afghanistan, of sort of new ideas coming forward. So you do see moments of inflection points, perhaps. But I don't think that it's the case that the potential for reform has been abandoned. I think you see President Ghani, for example, wrote a book about state building and building effective institutions. And I think in his writing, and Claire Lockhart is a co-author, you see the ambition that I think still is there for what is hoped for in Afghanistan. I mean, what's the realm of possibility? I mean, you heard my remarks there, but I don't think that the hope for reform is gone. Yeah, I think I'll stop there and turn it over for questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm going to bundle a few questions together that came in on the Q&A dashboard. So I think there's, the sense I get is that there's a sort of general takeaway that incrementalism is probably preferable to sort of grand sweeping reforms. And I wonder what that sort of approach to incrementalism in sort of state building, what that means for three other issue areas that some of our commentators or questioners have raised. One is about disarmament of non-state actors and militias. Another is about sort of democratic institutions and whether they, those can sort of exist within this incremental landscape. And the third is, what was my third one? Corruption. So maybe both of you guys can each take a couple minutes to reflect on that. Andrew, you want to start and then go to Elizabeth? Thanks.
I think, yeah, I think your incrementalism, right, is obviously pretty critical for me. On disarmament, I think that highlights how disarmament is going to be a particularly tricky challenge. Like the typical treatment for post-conflict societies is DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. And, you've seen in the past months, the Afghan government pushing for ceasefire and the Taliban pushing against that. I think that's a good indication that keeping weapons is going to be viewed as essential for the different groups' future stability. So I think that highlights how disarmament is going to be particularly tricky. And as we think about what's going to happen in the security forces, incremental change that recognizes, okay, is there a security force that controls a local area? How does that transition move forward? Thinking a lot about process and what is not going to spook the parties to basically just ditch an agreement is going to be the way to go over kind of traditional maybe practices in this space. Democratic institutions is a different story. I mean, how do you have a new constitution that's incremental? That's not, that I think is going to be one where I think there's been discussion about what the fundamental goals of the parties are in the space of governance, but I don't know that we've gotten a clear understanding of that, or at least I haven't. I'm sure there's experts out there who have. But what the realm for compromise in the constitutional space, given where the Taliban was, given where the government is one that, if peace talks get back to going, I think hopefully will be one for future progress. And then corruption, Elizabeth talked about this as well. My view is you're not going to get super far by saying we got to stop corruption. There's a sort of base level of corruption in how elites are not going to go for building judiciary systems that prosecute themselves. And if elites are part of the system, how do you get them to address corruption? And so close attention to how state institutions run is part of the story. But my guess is kind of, my one hypothesis is we got bigger problems in post-settlement Afghanistan. And establishing peace and figuring out a way forward, recognizing that there's going to be some leakage out of these institutions is maybe a realistic approach. Elizabeth, welcome your thoughts.
Thanks, Andrew. I think we're on a similar page on this. I think, Samir, as you point out, these are three areas where I really do see, think we see a clear trade-off between kind of long-term ideal objectives and short-term, perhaps necessary goals. And, similarly on disarmament of non-state actors, I think that is a long way off, that we would be seeing something along those lines. The conditions on the ground are just such right now that everyone is going to be hedging their bets. People are going to be moving in the opposite direction, quite frankly, to see how the next few months play out. So I think that is a longer term goal that, quite frankly, is probably more manageable in a situation in which we find some modicum of stability, right? So rather than trying to artificially push for that now, I think that is a longer term goal. Democratic institutions are interesting. So I think to a certain extent, they have taken on almost symbolic importance for those in and close to the government in Kabul, for whom they really do represent progress, right? Like this is the constitutional order, democracy in Afghanistan is something that has been achieved, and that one side of this is pretty desperate to hold on to, understandably so. But I would argue that in the current circumstances, it's important to focus on what goals exist for democratic institutions, what they are supposed to achieve, rather than the form of the institutions themselves. So there's been a longstanding debate over the need for decentralization, for example, in Afghanistan. It's a highly centralized state that brings in a number of challenges that I would argue, are worth a look at this point. And so, I would argue for a focus on what institutions in a future Afghan dispensation are supposed to achieve and deliver to their populations, and starting with that as a goal rather than getting stuck necessarily on the formal nature of any one institution as it exists right now. Corruption is really hard. I think as Andrew said, this is one where, quite frankly, international interveners have very little leverage and in some ways have contributed to the problem, right? The massive influx of external funding has only fed into these patronage networks, into the war economy, and it's going to be destabilizing as those resources inevitably dry up, particularly in the context of intensified conflict. It is going to be a really contested space right now, particularly in any sort of settlement situation in which the Taliban and other actors would look to be included in what is already going to be a shrinking pie. And so I think any sort of externally driven focus on corruption beyond just making that a goal over the longer term, it's probably, unfortunately, not the time to have that conversation. And that is a clear trade-off that we're going to see, but I don't see much traction for that conversation as now.
Okay, so I have tried to distill about 5 or 6 questions into about 3, then pose them to you both, and maybe each take 3 minutes to take on whatever pieces of those questions we have, and then we'll wrap up. So the first bundle of questions is really, Afghanistan sort of centric one, like what institutional reforms should we focus on? And maybe let's make that the royal we, whether we want to sort of speak in terms of the United States or the UN or the sort of interested parties of the international community, the regional parties. But what should be sort of the priority for institutional reform going forward? And you maybe sort of going to condition that based on what you expect sort of the post withdrawal world to look like. And I guess related to that, maybe this is more specific to the United States, is what leverage do international parties or the United States have, particularly when US and NATO troops are gone from the region? And I guess it was a specific question from one person about whether security sector reform in particular is feasible, and whether it can be coordinated through the UN or just amongst sort of a different set of major powers. Okay, so that's that one bundle of questions. That I know I was going to try to make that really more compact, but that's one bundle. The second is maybe related, is a kind of interesting one. Do you think we or any actors would help build institutions in Afghanistan if the Taliban took over? I think it's worth thinking about. It would be in our interest. And backing out to a third one, we've spent a lot of time today talking about the efficacy of institution building and when it runs into local politics. But I'm wondering about sort of the other end of that spectrum, about what about the politics that sort of beget institution building back home in the United States, in a number of European capitals, and sort of Western democratic countries that are maybe financing a lot of this. How sustainable is it to pitch a vision of enduring, long-term, costly, but incrementalist state building? I imagine there's probably some tension there where the vision we've sold in the past is big because that's how you justify taxpayer dollars. But if your vision is like, we're just going to incrementally change, 5% of the security sector to be a little less corrupt, and we're going to stay for 20 years to do it, I wonder if that's a politically sustainable venture for any leader to commit to. All right, so that's a lot of questions. Please take of it what you will. Maybe we'll start in reverse order. Elizabeth, you start first, and we'll go to Andrea.
Sounds good. Thanks, Samir. I will do my darndest, but hopefully Andrew can pick up as well. So in terms of institutional reforms to focus on, I think, as you say, Samir, it really will depend how things play out. I am not optimistic about stability in the near term. And so maybe useful to focus more on the leverage side of that question. So from the perspective of the US, for one, I think financial resources are key. I think the removal of sanctions on Taliban leaders are also going to be key. Facilitation of travel, visas, that sort of thing. This is one aspect of the process that has been critical to facilitating talks in Doha and elsewhere. And so to the extent that those processes are able to continue in parallel, that is leverage that the international community could use. On the side of the Kabul government, leverage is quite limited. It's really at this point more kind of the release of the remaining 7,000 or so Taliban prisoners. I don't expect that to come about, even though it was noted in the U.S. Taliban Agreement. It seems unlikely at this point that that's something that the U.S. is going to be able to convince Kabul to do in the near term. On the second question of institutions in Afghanistan, if the Taliban take over, I think it is necessary to think through as part of the process that Andrew referenced for the international community of coming to see the Taliban as a legitimate player in the political dispensation in Afghanistan. That's going to be a challenge. We have, though, seen some tacit cooperation with the Taliban against ISKP, for example, in those operations. So I think there is some room for those sorts of security-focused missions to play out. One thing that I'll highlight is in the U.S. Taliban agreement, there was a focus on areas of control. So the Taliban's commitments are limited to areas that the Taliban controls. That is a really messy formulation in a lot of ways, and at least in the public-facing documents, it's not clear how that's defined, but it does set up a scenario in which the Taliban are the main security providers in areas under their control, and indeed, in the readout of a call earlier this week with a senior administration official, that official referred to the Taliban as the CT partners who are required to fulfill their commitments vis-a-vis al-Qaeda, for example, in parts of the country. So I think on the security side in particular, that's something that we're likely to see going forward. And then lastly, in terms of political vision of state building in the US, this is a challenge, right? There is a trade-off between kind of this desire to end endless wars, but the persistent threat of terrorism and other dynamics. And so to the extent that the US wants to increasingly rely on local partners, the flip side of that is a need to invest in those partners, to train those partners. And I think even if we don't say it as explicitly, there will be a continued focus on building capacity remotely. So I will leave it there and hand it over to Andrew.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think reforms to focus on going forward. You make a good point about, I think, you talked about sanctions, and this is, again, another component of the U.S. Taliban agreement. One way to think about these questions together is to think about how important is the U.S. Taliban agreement for thinking about what this future settlement looks like. Is it the case that the request of the Taliban to limit the potential threat of terrorists from Afghanistan is one that can be relied upon or not? And how to think about that and going forward and shaping the international community's response. I don't think after 20 years of conflict, there's a lot of trust for the Taliban. There's, and for good reason, right? You have like there was a newspaper piece a while back talking about the Taliban, not saying that, look, like 9/11 wasn't done by al-Qaeda, sort of this kind of denial, which I don't think gives greater trust. So, thinking about this connects as well to the how do we think about dealing with if the Taliban took over. I don't know that that's a well understood end state. I think there's different varieties of what that would look like, and how the international community deals with that is going to depend. If it goes back to what it was pre 9/11, I don't think that there's a space for the international community to have good terms or to be in a place to trust that government, especially if that government continues to let terrorist groups threaten the security of the international community from Afghanistan. If that government has changed and has evolved, or if there's parts of Afghanistan that are under different control, as was the case pre 9/11, I think you can see more of a space for international humanitarian support to Afghanistan and different types of cooperation. So I think that's a lot on the Taliban and how these negotiations go forward and what that government looks like. There's going to be kind of an iterative negotiation with the international community, which has been and has expressed an intention to continue to provide support to Afghanistan, and what that looks like as that space is negotiated both through conflict and hopefully in peace negotiations. Related to that is a question about leverage. Ambassador Khalilzad, the lead state negotiator, testified to Congress a while back and emphasized that basically U.S. policy, that the level of support that the U.S. provides, what the U.S. does, is based on how the Taliban responds. So perhaps we're shifting to a space where there's a positive incentive are increased or reduced by the international community in response to the Taliban, versus a space where if there's no more troops, there's kind of negative repercussions. But how that works with a group who has been illegitimate, supporting, consorting with terrorists is a very different space, especially with the sanctions regime. So how do we move to a positive incentive relationship with a group who we have not seen as legitimate is a real challenge, and I don't know that that's one that is within the realm of possible for the international community. But that's the challenge. Security sector reform and the role of the UN. It's a good question of who, if at all, is going to be doing this security sector support, and what is that going to look like, and what's the model. The UN and others have been active in security sector reform in countries in Africa, for example, who are affected by serious conflict and where the government doesn't necessarily control all of the country. So depending how this evolves, I think you can look to different previous models of where and how different organizations provided that support. I don't know that it's outside of the realm of possibility, but I don't know that the politics are in a place where that role is knowable or easily scoped now. I think it's still in a place where for the next few months we're going to see kind of how that happens, and if there is movement on a peace agreement, then I think that becomes sort of the only credible step. But if there's not, then I don't know how that's going to evolve. I'm sure I have other thoughts, but I think I'll leave it at there. And thank you all, and look forward to continuing the conversation, perhaps another forum. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for a fantastic book and presentation. I hope all our participants and audience members will go out and take a look at the book and purchase it and read it, and continue the debate with Andrew and the Simpson Center, because I think this is a topic that is ripe for continued discussion, will not go away anytime soon. Thanks to Elizabeth for some fantastic discussing comments, to all of you in the audience for participating and for your poignant questions, and to our Simpson team for supporting this event. We'll continue to monitor these events in Afghanistan and sort of in the debates over state building and state effectiveness. It's a large part of what Simpson does, not just in the South Asia program, but across the board in many other programs. So please stay tuned, and we'll